92 seconds. That's the number they want burned into your brain, not the documents, not the oversight authority of Congress, not the constitutional obligations of the Department of Justice. A timestamp, a dramatic pause, a viral clip engineered to feel like a confession. Because in modern political warfare, perception outruns proof. Yes, Pam Bondi faced the House Judiciary Committee. Yes, Thomas Massie confronted her over the handling of Jeffrey Epstein-related files, redactions, and transparency. That clash happened. It was heated. It exposed fractures inside a party that publicly claims unity, and it raised real questions about whether the Department of Justice is protecting institutional credibility or protecting powerful names. But here's where the psychological trap snaps shut. The viral narrative circulating online doesn't just recount tension, it layers in cinematic specifics. A red folder thick as a phone book, a secret $847,000 wire transfer 2 days into Bondi's tenure, a Cayman Islands shell company, a J-matter notation, 92 seconds of perfectly timed silence presented as moral collapse. Those details are not substantiated in verified public reporting of that hearing, and that distinction matters more than the spectacle. Because when real institutional distrust exists, and it does, inserting unverified specifics into the bloodstream of public outrage doesn't strengthen accountability. It contaminates it. It gives defenders of opacity an escape hatch. They no longer have to answer for what actually happened. They can point to exaggerations and say the entire concern is conspiracy, and that is how legitimate scrutiny gets neutralized. Now step back. The confirmed conflict between Massie and Bondi was not about offshore routing numbers. It was about redactions. It was about who gets shielded and who gets exposed. It was about whether the DOJ's handling of Epstein-related materials protected victims or protected reputations. That is not a minor bureaucratic dispute. That is a structural test of democratic trust. Because here is the deeper tension spike. The Epstein case is uniquely combustible. It combines elite proximity, criminal depravity, international finance, political donors, and intelligence rumors. It is the perfect ecosystem for both legitimate outrage and manipulative storytelling. And when those two blend together, the public loses its ability to distinguish documented fact from narrative escalation. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. If the Justice Department redacts names, who decides which names? What standard is applied? Is it victim protection, ongoing investigation, national security, political sensitivity, and who audits that decision? If the answer is simply, trust us, that is not transparency. That is authority without verification. Now, widen the lens. The Department of Justice sits at the center of separation of powers. It is not just another agency. It enforces federal law. It defends the executive branch. It decides whom to prosecute and whom to decline. That discretion can reshape elections, reputations, and history. When an attorney general responds to congressional oversight as though it were partisan harassment instead of constitutional duty, something destabilizes. Because Congress does not ask questions as a courtesy, it asks questions as a co-equal branch of government. And when oversight devolves into theatrical confrontation, instead of documented clarification, we are not watching accountability. We are watching institutional erosion. Here's where it escalates. This is unfolding inside a broader political environment shaped by Donald Trump and a movement openly skeptical of independent institutions. The rhetoric is not subtle. Agencies are framed as enemies. Inspectors general are dismissed. Career civil servants are labeled disloyal. The deep state becomes a catch-all villain. In that environment, control of the Department of Justice is not just administrative power, it is strategic dominance. Because if you influence the referee, you influence the game. Now consider the psychological mechanics at work. On one side, officials can hide behind procedural language, ongoing matters, protected identities, classified materials. On the other side, influencers can flood the space with elaborate financial thrillers that feel airtight but lack verifiable sourcing. Between those forces, the average citizen gets exhausted, and exhaustion is the gateway to apathy. A democracy does not collapse in one dramatic moment. It erodes when the public stops believing clarity is possible. That is why the redaction controversy matters more than any cinematic wire transfer subplot. If redactions were mishandled, that must be proven and corrected. If victim identities were exposed or improperly shielded, that requires audit and accountability. If politically sensitive names were protected without legal basis, that is a scandal. But proving those things requires documented process, not viral narrative architecture. And here's the destabilizing question you should sit with. What if both sides benefit from the chaos? Officials benefit when the story becomes so exaggerated that legitimate criticism loses credibility. Political operatives benefit when outrage becomes monetizable content. The algorithm rewards the most emotionally charged version of events. The quieter, documented reality struggles to compete. Meanwhile, trust declines. And declining trust is not neutral. It creates a vacuum. Vacuums get filled by power. You may think the core issue is whether Bondi answered a question forcefully enough. It isn't. The core issue is whether the Department of Justice can withstand partisan gravity and remain structurally independent. Because if prosecutorial discretion becomes politically aligned rather than legally grounded, then obstruction doesn't announce itself. It hides in process. It hides in delay. It hides in classification stamps. And by the time the public notices, the precedent is already normalized. Here is the point of no return moment. If Americans cannot demand verifiable documentation from their Justice Department without being drowned in spectacle, then oversight becomes theater. And once oversight is theater, power operates backstage. That is how constitutional decay accelerates, not with tanks in the street, but with ambiguity in the record. You are not a passive viewer in this equation. The theme of this episode is not a dramatic pause. It is institutional trust under stress. It is the fragile line between transparency and manipulation. It is whether you, as a citizen, can still distinguish documented accountability from algorithmic amplification. If you disengage because the noise feels overwhelming, the only voices left shaping the narrative will be the loudest and the least accountable. If you consume only the most explosive version of events, you become easier to steer. Civic vigilance is not about outrage. It is about sustained attention to verified process. So stay connected to this investigation, not because it's dramatic, but because it's structural. Track what is filed, what is redacted, what standards are cited, what audits occur, and who is ultimately held responsible. If the Justice Department fails, that failure must be proven with evidence strong enough to survive court, not just survive a trending cycle. Your attention is leverage. Your discernment is defense. If you choose spectacle over documentation, institutions learn they can wait you out. If you insist on documented accountability, you make erosion harder. The Republic does not need more viral moments. It needs citizens who refuse to let power hide behind either silence or sensationalism. Stay vigilant, not because it's dramatic, because it's constitutional.